Good morning and welcome to Studio 5 going live, day 16, I believe. As numbers are not important, but it is day 16 of the Studio 5 online summer exhibition. Today we're going to be looking at a book that is quite, for me, quite important because it sort of, I hope, exemplifies or shows how I treat books. The title of the book is Clay Travels and it's about the work of a Singaporean ceramic artist called Iskandar Jalil. I do apologize if that is the incorrect pronunciation, but that's what I say. Anyway, let's get down to some technical details, I suppose. The book itself measures, when closed, 31.4 centimetres by 24.6 centimetres by 4 centimetres. It's a full-edged leather binding, section sewn with secondary sewing, full-edge decoration, hand-sewn end bands, three-quarter hollow, leather skirting, edge-to-edge doublure, leather jointed end papers, with panels. I think that's about the technical details of it. Can't think of anything more. No, that's about it. Anyway, the book itself is about the work of Iskandar Jalil, who is a sort of a national living treasure. He was born in 1940 in Singapore, and his work is sublime. It really is, and I really do suggest that if you do have a 5 minutes where you're looking at the computer screen and have got no idea what you're doing there, have a look at his work. It really is something else. His work is in national, international collections around the world, and he's been awarded so many awards that it reads like a who's who almost. It really is something else. The binding, I'm a very strong believer in books having an individual voice, and I do try to use different materials to reflect what is happening within the text block itself. The idea for me of just doing the same technique with variations in colour and maybe variations in design on different books with different contents is completely alien to me. I really don't understand why. I do understand, of course, that for a lot of people it pays the bills, and if you can churn out the same thing day after day, then that's great. And of course, you get that's that technique and that's a so-and-so work and that sort of thing. I try not to fall into that category with works of this nature. With my own personal work, of course, yes, I do tend to follow themes, but I do move on. And I think the majority of artists that work I admire do that. I can't, for the life of me, see why people would do the same thing day in and day out, especially when it's creative and especially when the subject matter can be so diverse as it is with books, book binding and book arts. Anyway, that's my little voice thing over. The binding itself, it reflects the color palette of the artist, and is very, very textured. A little bit more about the texturing later on, but what I'd like to do is just try and get a close in. Now we have to remember that the artist, the ceramic artist, I tried to give the feel of it being like ceramic, so we can see up and down the spine we've got this multiple raised bands along the spine, which are very reminiscent, of course, of turn or hand handwork. Hand, when you're on the potter's wheel and you're working the clay and you're hand drawing a pot up, you get these runs in it where your fingers have been, or indeed a very simple coil pot. So that's very much, and we can just make out a little bit of texture. I'd say the colors come from the palettes that the artist used, and also he incorporates wood within the work itself as well. As I say, have a really good look at his work and you'll understand exactly where I'm coming from with this. The impressions again reflect the artist's work and the way that he uses glaze, slip, all sorts of things to create really quite wonderful ceramic artworks. I do use word artworks with them because they really do traverse sculpture and all sorts of things, and he does impress into the clay hand letters. It's a form of printing which is very similar to the way that Sumerians use their sort of scroll sort of things. Anyway, that's a little bit of history, I suppose. So let's go into the book itself. Well, as we can see from the texture and everything, we've got really quite wonderful things happening, and I do in this particular book, I've also, in the front border, we can just make that out here, we can see that there is a sort of a little bit of antique sort of information about Singapore itself, and a little bit about the history, because again, the artist himself, he does draw upon the historical elements of the region of his country, Singapore. Now we go into the doublure and the end paper, and for those of us who are not sure what a doublure or end paper is, I did cover this in a couple of posts ago. Perhaps you may wish to revisit. But anyway, what we're looking at here is again a worked doublure, and we can see that the part of the doublure is continuing on this feeling of ceramics. Now, a little bit about the texture. One of the beauties of having international students coming over, before lockdown of course, is that when they go home, you've got a sort of a pool of information, all sorts of things. When I was given this particular commission, I was asked, you know, what I would like to do with it, and I thought, well, as a ceramic artist, Singapore, let's get some clay from Singapore. So I asked one of my students in Singapore, Adeline Coe, thank you very much indeed, links will be provided, don't worry, if she could send me a kilo of clay. About a week and a half, 2 weeks later, thud, as the clay landed, not necessarily in my lap, and it was there. So the textures have been created using a model maker's clay, which has been mixed with the earth of Singapore. So it is a very, you know, I'm trying to get as close as I can to the actual material itself. And we can just make out all these bits of texture. We can also see from the doublure itself that part of the doublure is of this decorated paper, again using the same colour palette as the ceramic artist. But as we go to the end paper, we can see that the colours and the themes have been carried on, so that the doublure is connected visually to the end paper. And again, what I wanted to do is create a feeling of, you know, very much action, of work happening, and also outlines of ceramic vessels. And we can just make out these outlines here, the vessels perhaps standing on a shelf, and again slip falling off as the artist works. It's a very cool book, actually. It was great to work with. Oh yes, there's full edge decoration. The edges of the pages have been whited out. They are all different colours. And as we go into the back end paper and the back doublure, we can begin to see that the pattern carries on from the front to the back. So there is that continuation. But again, it's not just, again with colours and things, but it's not just, you know, sort of a repeat pattern or a marble paper. It's each one has been worked. And again, if I can just turn this around so we get a slightly better view of it, perhaps, just like this, we can see the paper with all these things is obviously a little bit heavy as well. Is we can see that I've got various printing techniques happening here, because again this echoes the way that the artist pushes shapes into the wet clay to really form a great sense of depth to the work as well. And again, what we can see here is we can see that the doublure, again, a little bit more history from about Singapore. And again, if we can just tighten in on here, I hope we can, you can begin to see that along the edges, and in fact all over the binding, there are worked designs which has been done using a traditional scroll wheel, which bookbinders use to create repeat patterns. But I've used it with the modelling clay to form not just a visual but also a physical texture, and working colour into it and really sort of working it. It produces a really cool finish, I think. Again, you know, books don't have to be flat, they don't have to be boring. You know, one can go for it, because I sincerely believe that books, they do have a voice of their own, an individual nature. And what I always try to do, as I say, is capture that individual nature of the book. And bear with me one second. Individual nature of the book, the content, the artist, to create a very overall picture of the artist's work. Anyway, a little bit of close-up, and again perhaps we can see that texture all over the binding. Once again, I'd like to thank you all very, very much indeed for being here and taking the time to watch. And once again, let's be safe, use protection at all times, And I would like to thank, talking of protection, but not really, I'd like to thank the De Wilde collection for allowing us to see this. This is part of a private collection, so it's a very rare opportunity to see this work. And over the next couple of days, I will be showing you some more from that private collection. Thank you all very, very much indeed. Wear protection, follow sensible advice, don't necessarily follow what the politicians do, and of course I look forward to seeing you all tomorrow. And this was Studio 5, and I was live.